He was labeled a troublemaker, benched without explanation, and cast aside when all he ever did was work harder than anyone else. While others played under the spotlight, he trained in the shadows, quiet, determined, and forgotten. But when everything was on the line and the world was finally watching, he didn't just play, he rose. What happened next shocked everyone, including the coach who tried to silence him. This is the incredible story of Jamal Carter, a young man who proved that true greatness doesn't need permission. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if this story speaks to you, share your thoughts. Your voice matters here. Now, settle in, because this story will stay with you long after the final word. The sun hung low over the town of Riverview, its amber rays spilling across the high school football field like melted gold. It was one of those southern towns where nothing mattered more on a Friday night than the roar of the crowd, the scent of fresh-cut grass, and the crack of helmets colliding under the stadium lights. In this town, football wasn't just a sport, it was a ritual, a heartbeat, a living thing. And for 17-year-old Jamal Carter, it was the only way out. Jamal had always run faster, jumped higher, and thought quicker than the boys around him. He wasn't just talented, he was electric, the kind of player that made people stop talking mid-sentence and lean forward when he touched the ball. His moves were poetry in motion, smooth and instinctive like they were born in his bones. But Riverview wasn't a town that welcomed poetry from boys who looked like Jamal. Raised by his grandmother, Miss Thelma, after losing his mother to breast cancer and never knowing his father, Jamal grew up knowing the value of silence, of staying out of trouble, of keeping his head down. But even as he tried to walk the line, there was something about him, his posture, his gaze, his refusal to shrink, that made him stand out. Not everyone liked that. Jamal had dreams so big they barely fit into the walls of his modest brick house on the east side of town. He wanted to make it to the NFL, not for the money or the fame, but for his grandmother, whose arthritic hands still cooked his meals and pressed his uniforms, and for his little cousins, who stared at him like he hung the stars. He wanted to build something better than what he'd been given, and that dream lived and breathed through football. Every morning before school, Jamal ran laps around the neighborhood in beat-up sneakers, dodging barking dogs and potholes. After practice, when the other players hit the showers, he stayed behind, catching passes from the backup quarterback under the fading light. He wasn't just good, he was obsessed, and people noticed. The stands buzzed every time he touched the ball. College scouts began circling, some discreet, some bold. His name started appearing in whispers and online rankings. But none of that seemed to sit right with Coach Frank Daniels. Coach Daniels was a Riverview institution, having led the Panthers for over 20 years. He was old school in every way, tight-lipped, tough, and proud. He'd built his legacy on discipline and control, and he expected players to fall in line without question. In his eyes, football was about obedience as much as it was about skill. So when Jamal, bright-eyed, confident, unafraid, began taking up space in the spotlight, it triggered something in him. At first it was subtle, a quiet remark during film sessions, a benching after what he called excessive celebration, a cold shoulder in the locker room. Jamal, raised to respect authority, kept his head down. But it became clear that no matter how hard he worked, how well he played, there was an invisible ceiling pressing down on him. During one early season practice, Coach Daniels barked a run play Jamal knew wouldn't work based on the defensive setup. When Jamal suggested an audible, his tone respectful, his logic sound, Coach's eyes narrowed like he'd been challenged, not advised. From that moment on, the tension grew like ivy, slowly wrapping itself around every interaction. Jamal still played, and he played well, but praise came reluctantly, and criticism came often. Still, he smiled through it. Miss Thelma reminded him that sometimes strength was quiet, and not all battles needed to be fought out loud. But Jamal was a teenager carrying the weight of dreams too big for his age, and the cracks, though invisible, began to spread. His teammates saw it. Some admired him, some envied him, but few spoke up. And Jamal, in the solitude of his bedroom at night, began to wonder if talent alone would ever be enough. Outside, The season was just beginning, and the community still showed up in droves, wearing blue and silver, waving banners, and sipping from steaming thermoses. But inside, on that team, a storm was beginning to gather. It was more than football. It was about respect, about identity, about what was allowed and what wasn't when you came from Jamal's side of town. And though he didn't know it yet, one decision, one benching, would soon change everything. Coach Frank Daniels had seen a lot in his 32 years of coaching high school football. He'd seen rising stars burn out, promising athletes crumble under pressure, and quiet boys turn into fierce leaders under his guidance. He took pride in that. He believed his way worked because it always had. He wore the same ball cap he'd worn since the state championship in 2003 and still carried a clipboard instead of using a tablet like the younger coaches. To his players, he was an immovable force, the lawn and off the field. He didn't yell much, but when he did, the sound sliced through the air like a whip. He demanded discipline, structure, humility, and above all, obedience. So when Jamal Carter, the junior wide receiver who could make defenders trip over their own feet, started attracting attention, Coach Daniels took note. Not of the talent, he saw that clear as day, but of the confidence. The way Jamal stood straight, looked him in the eye, called him sir, but still spoke with certainty, still offered opinions. It was subtle at first. A comment here, a look there. When Jamal suggested adjustments in the locker room, Daniels called it talking out of turn. When Jamal stayed late to run drills with the younger kids, Daniels accused him of trying to show off. Jamal had always been taught to respect authority, but not to diminish himself in doing so. That lesson, instilled by Miss Thelma with equal parts love and steel, shaped everything he did. And so he tried to balance it, nodding when spoken to, keeping his tone calm, but never shrinking. Still, Coach Daniels saw each quiet assertion as a challenge. Their relationship began to strain during one particular practice early in the season. The team was scrimmaging under a heavy gray sky. Daniels barked a running play, one that Jamal knew wouldn't work. He saw the way the defense had shifted, the gap that had closed off, and out of habit, out of instinct, he raised his voice just enough to offer a different option. "Coach, that safety's creeping up. Might want to switch to a slant route," he said. There was no arrogance in his tone, just urgency. Daniel stared at him for a long second before blowing the whistle and resetting the drill, but something in his jaw tightened. That night, Jamal didn't sleep well. He kept replaying the moment in his head, wondering if he'd said too much. But the following practice, Coach Daniels ran him hard. And when Jamal slipped on a wet patch of grass during a play, Daniels didn't call out encouragement like he usually did. Instead, he walked past him and muttered, a little less talking, a little more focus. Jamal's teammates began noticing the shift. Malik, the quarterback and Jamal's closest friend on the team, pulled him aside. "He's on you, man. For no reason. Just keep balling. That's all you can do." Jamal nodded, but the weight of being watched, scrutinized, second-guessed at every turn started sinking in. At school, he felt it too. A few teachers who once smiled now looked at him with narrowed eyes, like they'd heard something. Rumors always ran faster than truth in small towns, and the phrase, "he's got an attitude," started popping up like thorns in conversation. One afternoon, Jamal stayed behind after practice to pick up discarded water bottles. Daniels came out of his office, saw him, and instead of offering a word of thanks, simply said, "You think that makes you special? Humble people don't have to prove it." It stung more than Jamal expected. It wasn't just criticism. It was mischaracterization, an effort to paint him as something he wasn't. But he kept showing up. He trained harder, ran faster, studied film longer than anyone else. He didn't respond with words. He responded with work. Still, Daniel's actions began to escalate. Jamal was benched during non-critical downs. Plays were designed to route around him. In team meetings, praise was given sparingly, even when he'd had a great game. Once, after scoring 2 touchdowns in the first half, he returned to the sideline smiling, high-fiving teammates. Daniels pulled him aside and growled, "You're not in the NFL yet. Sit down and act like you've been there before." Jamal sat, quietly, but a flicker of frustration began to burn inside him. It wasn't about ego. It was about fairness, about the constant need to prove his worth while others with less skill were embraced and encouraged. And the worst part was, he knew why. He didn't fit the mold. He wasn't deferential. He wasn't timid. And he wasn't white. Daniels never said anything overt. He didn't need to. It was in the way he spoke, or didn't. The way he demanded Jamal shrink just enough to be less threatening. Miss Thelma noticed the change. She saw the tired slump in Jamal's shoulders when he came home, the tightness around his eyes. One night, over a plate of meatloaf, she placed her hand over his and said, "You don't have to make yourself smaller for anyone. Just be you. And if they don't see it now, they will one day." He nodded, swallowing hard. That night, he went out and ran drills in the backyard until the moon was high overhead. Something had shifted. He knew the tension with Coach Daniels wasn't going away, but he didn't yet know just how far the coach would go, or how that one friction would crack wide open in front of the whole town. It was the kind of night that felt written in ink, where everything shimmered with purpose and anticipation thick in the air. The Riverview Panthers were facing their longtime rivals, the Bellwood Titans, in a mid-season game that meant more than just rankings. The Titans had embarrassed them last year, and the town hadn't forgotten. The bleachers overflowed with neighbors, alumni, reporters, and recruiters. It was the kind of game where reputations were built or broken. And at the heart of it stood Jamal Carter, warming up under the high lights with a focus so sharp it looked like armor. His cleats dug into the turf like claws. Every muscle moved with control, every breath measured. He knew this was his chance, his moment not just to play, but to remind everyone who he was. Not the kid with the so-called attitude, but the kid with talent that could silence a crowd. From the opening whistle, the game roared like a fire out of control. Bellwood came hard and fast, but the Panthers matched them blow for blow. Jamal was electric. In the first quarter, he took a short pass across the middle and spun out of 2 tackles before sprinting 58 yards to the end zone. The crowd exploded. Scouts scribbled notes furiously. Even Coach Daniels had no choice but to nod. But it was in the second half that Jamal became unforgettable. With the game tied and minutes ticking down, Bellwood marched deep into Panther territory. A touchdown would seal it. The stadium buzzed like a beehive. Jamal, who'd played both ways in crunch moments before, lined up at cornerback. The Titans quarterback snapped the ball, eyes locked on his star receiver. As the pass flew through the air, a perfect spiral aimed high toward the corner of the end zone, Jamal launched. He soared with grace and fury, snatching the ball from the sky like it was meant for him all along. The interception sent the crowd into a frenzy. He didn't just stop the drive. He reignited hope. On the very next series, Jamal took a screen pass, juked 2 defenders, and dragged a third for the first down. On 3rd and long, with 30 seconds remaining, he lined up again. The snap came. Malik fired the ball downfield. Jamal caught it in stride, darted toward the pylon, and scored. Pandemonium. The announcer's voice cracked from screaming his name. People stomped and cheered so hard the bleachers trembled. Jamal pointed to the sky, dropped to one knee, and mouthed a silent prayer, just like his mama used to teach him. Then he thumped his chest, not with arrogance, but with gratitude, with release, with everything he'd held back. But Coach Daniels saw something else. He didn't see relief. He didn't see pride. He saw showboating. He saw defiance. And after the final whistle blew and the team gathered, drenched in sweat and glory, Daniels didn't celebrate with them. Instead, he pulled Jamal aside behind the locker rooms, away from the cameras, away from the scouts. "You embarrassed this team tonight," he said, voice low but venomous. Jamal blinked, stunned. "Coach, I disrespected the game," Daniels snapped. "That celebration? That attitude? That's not how a Panther carries himself." "But I played my heart out," Jamal said, his voice cracking with disbelief. "I didn't curse, I didn't taunt, don't talk back to me," Daniels growled. "I've had enough. You're benched until further notice." The words landed like a blow to the gut. For a second, Jamal thought he'd misheard. But Daniels walked away without another word, leaving Jamal standing there in the cooling night air, still catching his breath from the touchdown that had won them the game. Word traveled fast. By Monday morning, The school buzzed with whispers. He's benched. Why? That makes no sense. The team was stunned. Malik argued with Daniels in the coach's office and got a warning himself. Parents began murmuring in the parking lot. Some called it character building. Others called it something else. Jamal sat in the bleachers during practice, helmet in his hands, heart somewhere far below his ribs. He had done everything right. He had trained harder, studied longer, played smarter. And yet, here he was, punished not for failing, but for shining. Daniels addressed the team without using his name. No one is bigger than the game, he said. No one is above the rules. But the rules had never been written in ink. Not for everyone. Miss Thelma tried to comfort Jamal that night, but even her strong hands couldn't pull the sting from his chest. They can't take away who you are, she whispered. No matter what they say, your light's too bright to smother. But Jamal felt like a ghost in his own skin, watching his future evaporate with every day he sat in silence. And still, Daniels didn't waver. The bench became Jamal's sentence. But deep within him, a new fire began to rise. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Something told him this moment. The injustice, the humiliation, was the beginning of something far greater than he could yet understand. The days that followed Jamal's benching moved like molasses, thick and slow, every hour dragging behind it the weight of unspoken words and unshed frustration. Monday morning began with whispers, students in hallways pausing mid-conversation when Jamal walked past, their eyes darting away, unsure if they should offer sympathy or distance. He kept his shoulders square and eyes forward, the way Miss Thelma had always taught him, but inside, something vital had begun to splinter. He sat through his classes half listening, his mind still trapped on the field under those lights, replaying every second of that game-winning touchdown, trying to see the crime everyone else seemed to think he had committed. In the locker room, the air turned brittle. Teammates who used to joke with him now kept their voices low. Some still patted him on the back when no one was looking. Others avoided him altogether. Malik, loyal as ever, spoke out during warm-ups. We need Jamal out there. He won that game for us. Coach Daniels didn't even turn his head. This team needs discipline more than talent. And just like that, the silence deepened. Malik stopped speaking. Jamal stopped asking. At practices, Jamal sat on the metal bench near the 40-yard line, helmet in hand, eyes following every drill. It was like watching a movie of his own life that he wasn't allowed to be in anymore. He ran plays in his head, memorized routes, timed quarterback throws by instinct. The pads still clashed, the whistles still blew, the sun still set, but all happened without him. Each afternoon, he went home to the scent of cornbread and the quiet clatter of Miss Thelma's cooking. She tried to keep his spirits up, asking about homework, reminding him the Lord didn't bring him this far to leave him now. But Jamal's smile, once effortless, had become a performance. He stopped eating as much. He stayed up later. His phone, once buzzing with texts from teammates and scout interest, sat cold and quiet on his nightstand. Recruiters who'd been circling now went silent. They didn't say why. They didn't need to. Coaches talked. Word spread. And somewhere, someone must have decided that Jamal Carter, the star wide receiver from Riverview, was too risky. Too bold. Too much. Teachers began treating him differently, too. His English teacher, who used to praise his essays, started docking him for tone. His history teacher stopped calling on him altogether. It was as if being benched stripped him of more than playing time. It stripped him of worth. Even the halls of the school, once filled with laughter and the occasional "Yo, Jamal" from underclassmen, now echoed like empty gymnasiums. One Thursday, Jamal found a flyer stuffed into his locker. It read, "No attitude zone. Only team players allowed." He didn't need to ask who put it there. He just folded it in half, placed it in his backpack, and walked to his next class. He didn't show it to Miss Thelma. Some burdens were too bitter to share. That night, he laced up his sneakers and ran sprints in the dark. The street lamps flickered above him, casting long shadows on the cracked sidewalk. Each stride was a scream, each breath a vow. He wasn't going to let this break him. But there were moments, especially in the dead of night, when doubt crept in like fog. What if this was it? What if they'd stolen not just this season, but his whole future? What if no one ever saw past the label Coach Daniels had stamped on him? Meanwhile, Daniels continued with business as usual. In post-game interviews, he talked about team chemistry and discipline. When asked about Jamal, he offered vague statements about internal matters. No apology, no clarification, just silence wrapped in protocol. And people began to accept it, or pretend to, because it was easier to believe the boy had an attitude than to confront the idea that maybe, just maybe, the coach everyone trusted had made a mistake. Or worse, had done it on purpose. Jamal kept showing up, not just to practice, but to class, to film sessions, to weight training. He did every rep, took every note, said yes, sir, and no, sir. But inside, he was burning. Not with anger, at least not only that, but with the frustration of being invisible in plain sight. It was Malik who finally said what no one else dared to. You're being punished for having fire, for being excellent and not apologizing for it. Jamal didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew the truth. But what neither of them knew was that someone else had been watching quietly from the sidelines of this slow fall from grace. Someone who'd seen the game, who'd seen the tape, who had begun asking questions. Someone who didn't buy into secondhand reputations or whispered rumors. And though Jamal couldn't see it yet, the tide that had turned so cruelly against him was about to shift again. Just not the way anyone expected. It was a cold Monday evening when a knock came at the door, 3 soft raps barely loud enough to rise above the hum of the stovetop, where Miss Thelma was stirring a pot of collard greens. Jamal sat at the kitchen table, chin resting on one hand, homework open in front of him, but his mind miles away. He didn't look up until Miss Thelma wiped her hands on a towel and went to answer. On the other side stood a man in a windbreaker with a school emblem stitched on the chest and a face weathered by seasons of disappointment and quiet victories. Coach Reynolds, the assistant coach most kids liked, but rarely took seriously because he didn't bark orders or throw clipboards. He gave quiet advice, stood behind the head coach without much fanfare, and always carried a spiral notebook filled with stats, schemes, and silent thoughts. Jamal hadn't expected to see him here, not after everything. But there he was, eyes sincere, voice low. "Evening, ma'am," he said, nodding respectfully at Miss Thelma. "Mind if I have a word with Jamal?" Miss Thelma studied him a moment, then stepped aside. Jamal followed him to the porch, where the evening air nipped at their sleeves and the cicadas hummed between silences. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Reynolds sighed, long and deep, like someone carrying something too heavy for too long. "I should have said something sooner," he began. "I watched it all happen. You play your heart out, and then he benched you. Not because of anything you did wrong, but because you made him uncomfortable. You were too good, too sure of yourself, and he didn't like it. That's on him. But I let it slide, and that's on me." Jamal didn't respond right away. He wasn't used to adults, especially those connected to the team, admitting fault, much less aligning with him. "Why are you telling me this now?" he finally asked. Reynolds shifted his weight, looked out at the street where a lone car crept by under the yellow glow of a flickering lamppost. "Because I've been sending your film out. Quietly, not through the school channels. Just clips I saved. Your routes, your footwork, that pick in the Bellwood game. I've got a buddy who scouts for colleges. I sent it to him last week. He called me yesterday and asked if you were for real. I told him you were the realest thing this town's seen in a decade." Jamal's heart thudded once hard, but they heard about what happened. "They did," Reynolds said, "and that's why I'm here. I'm not going to let your story be written by one man's pride. I believe in what I saw on that field. And if you're willing, I think others will too." For the first time in weeks, something shifted in Jamal's chest. Not hope exactly, but the beginning of it. He looked at the man beside him, saw no agenda, no pity, just quiet conviction. "I'm willing," he said. Reynolds nodded, then pulled a thumb drive from his jacket pocket. "There's more on here. Combined footage. Practice drills. Use it however you need." From that night forward, something began to change. Not out in the open, but in the undercurrent of possibility that now flowed beneath the silence. Jamal threw himself into workouts with renewed purpose, training with a focus that burned away the residue of doubt. He met up with Marcus Jameson, a former Riverview star who had played a few seasons in the league before a knee injury brought him home. Marcus had heard about what happened through the grapevine and offered to help. "I know what it's like," he told Jamal, "to be told you're too much when really, you're just enough." They trained in the early mornings before school and again after sunset, when the fields were empty but the hunger still roared. Marcus pushed him hard, correcting his stance, refining his release, teaching him how to study defenders like predators learn prey. "Talent gets you noticed," he said. "Discipline gets you kept." Meanwhile, Reynolds continued to work behind the scenes, reaching out to a network of scouts and assistants, men and women who had once been told which players to watch and which to ignore, but who'd learned that sometimes the real gems weren't the ones handed to them. They were the ones they had to find. Word began to spread, cautiously at first. Jamal Carter, the bench star from Riverview, was the real deal. A few scouts showed up at Riverview's remaining games, sitting low in the bleachers in neutral jackets, taking notes, watching a player who wasn't allowed to play. They asked questions, not just to Coach Daniels, whose answers were clipped and dismissive, but to teachers, to janitors, to cafeteria staff, to anyone who might have known Jamal beyond the shadow cast by his benching. What they heard painted a different picture. A young man respectful, hardworking, the first to help and the last to leave. They saw his grades, his volunteer hours, the letters of recommendation some teachers wrote unprompted. And still, Jamal sat on the sidelines each Friday night, helmet in hand, heart pounding as his teammates ran plays he knew he could have elevated. He watched every move, memorized every mistake, stored every lesson like a squirrel hiding food for winter. He didn't sulk. He didn't lash out. He waited, because now someone else was watching. And unlike before, this time they were really seeing. The first time it happened, Jamal didn't even know they were there. He just finished a solo workout on the practice field long after everyone else had gone home. The sun had dropped low behind the bleachers, casting long shadows that stretched across the turf like tired limbs, and the air held that heavy silence only found in small towns after dark. Jamal slung his gym bag over one shoulder, wiped the sweat from his brow, and turned toward the gate. He didn't notice the two men seated in a parked sedan near the far corner of the lot, their windows down just enough to breathe, their eyes locked on him as he moved with that unmistakable athletic rhythm, controlled, efficient, sure. The second time, they were bolder. Jamal had arrived at the field early one Saturday morning, only to find an unfamiliar SUV already parked near the fence. A man stepped out, not in a suit like the recruiters he'd imagined, but in jeans and a simple pullover with a college logo half covered by a windbreaker. He introduced himself as Coach Barlow from a Division I program that Jamal had admired from afar. "Just wanted to see what I've been hearing about," he said, smiling in a way that felt real, not rehearsed. Jamal didn't say much. He didn't have to. His presence spoke louder than anything else, the quiet readiness in his stance, the way his eyes stayed level, alert, confident, but not cocky. Coach Barlow watched him stretch, chatted briefly, and then nodded as if confirming something to himself. "Keep working," he said before leaving. "We'll be watching." After that, the visits came more frequently, never announced, never acknowledged by the school. They didn't go through official channels because they knew Coach Daniels would block access. So they watched from the shadows, sitting in rental cars or leaning against chain-link fences at just the right distance to stay unnoticed. Reynolds helped when he could, tipping them off about Jamal's workout times, slipping them updated clips. Marcus kept refining Jamal's training, pushing him to perfect every movement, every detail, knowing that scouts didn't just look for speed and hands anymore. They looked for polish, mental toughness, coachability. And Jamal delivered. With each passing week, his body grew sharper, stronger, faster. His mind more focused. He began to anticipate not just the movement of defenders, but the movement of opportunity itself. When to speak, when to stay quiet, when to show up, and just let the work speak louder than the whispers. He still sat every Friday night in full gear, helmet beside him, back straight, gaze fixed on the field where he should have been. Some of the crowd had started to notice too. The student section began chanting his name during big plays. Parents in the stands whispered about the injustice. Even local reporters, initially cautious, began questioning why the team's best weapon remained unused. Coach Daniels held his line, his jaw clenched like stone. "It's not about talent," he told a local paper. "It's about team culture. We can't tolerate arrogance, no matter how skilled the player." But more and more people began to see the cracks in that explanation. And still, Jamal said nothing publicly. He didn't go to social media, didn't rant, didn't beg. He trained. He studied. He waited. Then one night, as he was leaving the gym, another man approached him, older, with silvering hair and a firm handshake. He introduced himself as a regional scout for a major university known for producing elite receivers. "We've been following you quietly," he said. "There's a lot of noise around you, and we wanted to hear from a source." Jamal didn't flinch. "All I've done is show up and do the work," he replied. "Everything else is someone else's story, not mine." The man studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You've got more than talent," he said. "You've got poise. That counts for something." He handed Jamal a business card. "We'll be in touch. Stay ready." That night, Jamal stood in front of the bathroom mirror and stared at his reflection, sweat still glistening on his forehead. He thought about his mother, who never got to see him wear the Panthers uniform. He thought about Miss Thelma's hands, cracked and tired from years of work, and how she'd never once complained. And he thought about that field, still under stadium lights, still filled with teammates who knew what he could do, but were too afraid to say it out loud. He didn't need a stage to know his worth anymore. The visits, though hidden, were a quiet affirmation that his story wasn't ending in silence. It was just beginning to echo in new places. And somewhere deep down, he understood that when the time finally came, it wouldn't be Coach Daniels who decided what kind of future Jamal Carter would have. It would be Jamal himself, because the truth had begun to travel, carried not by complaint, but by performance. Not by excuses, but by consistency. And the right eyes, the ones that mattered, were finally starting to see clearly. The morning the email went out, it landed like a pebble in a pond, its ripples subtle at first, but widening with quiet force. The sender was Tyler McRae, a well-respected regional scout with 2 decades of experience and an eye for talent so precise it had made him something of a legend in the Southeastern Circuit. He wasn't flashy. He didn't chase headlines. But when Tyler spoke, programs listened. The email, sent to a curated list of college recruiters, athletic directors, and position coaches, was short, barely 5 paragraphs, but every word carried weight. He'd been watching Jamal Carter, the benched wide receiver from Riverview High, for several weeks. He described Jamal's athleticism as explosive, his route running surgical, and his instincts off the charts. But it wasn't just talent that Tyler focused on. It was character. Despite being benched for reasons still unclear, he wrote, "This young man has continued to train, support his team, and handle himself with remarkable maturity. I've scouted dozens of athletes who look good on film. Few show the kind of discipline under adversity that Jamal has demonstrated. If your program values integrity as much as performance, you should be paying attention." That email, though unseen by Jamal himself, began to change things. Recruiters who had hesitated now picked up their phones. A few quietly drove through Riverview, unannounced, circling the school parking lot, hoping to catch a glimpse of the player they'd heard was too good to ignore. Some reached out to Reynolds, who confirmed what they'd heard. Yes, Jamal was still training. Yes, he was available. And yes, the situation with Coach Daniels wasn't about behavior or grades. It was about control. One assistant coach from a major SEC program even flew in under the radar, checked into a cheap motel, and watched Jamal's Sunday morning workout from behind a row of bushes. When he returned to campus, he told his staff, "If we let this kid fall through the cracks, it's on us." Back in Riverview, Jamal remained unaware of the full storm brewing quietly around him. He noticed a few more unfamiliar faces lingering near the field. He caught glances that lingered a second too long at the gas station, the grocery store. And sometimes, as he ran drills with Marcus or stretched alone under the goalpost, he felt a presence watching. Not the heavy weight of judgment, but the careful gaze of someone evaluating something precious. Coach Daniels noticed it too. He saw the men with notepads, the rental cars with out-of-state plates. He knew what it meant, and it irritated him more than he could admit. He doubled down, tightening rules, reducing Jamal's reps in practice to almost nothing, refusing to acknowledge questions from the media. When one reporter asked directly why Jamal continued to sit, Daniels' jaw clenched, and he simply replied, "Team reasons." But people were no longer satisfied with silence. In a town like Riverview, news moved in whispers, but outrage traveled like fire. Parents started to ask questions at school board meetings. One father stood up and said, "Why are we punishing our most promising student-athlete when he's done nothing but show up and work?" Daniels dismissed it publicly, but the pressure was mounting. Then came the podcast. A small but respected show focused on high school football in the South picked up the story. They interviewed Reynolds anonymously. They played clips of Jamal's highlight reel. They cited McCray's email. The episode went viral, first locally, then across state lines. And suddenly, what had been a quiet injustice became a very loud question. Who benches a star like Jamal Carter? And why? Jamal's name began trending in circles that had once written him off. Sports blogs picked up the podcast. Former players weighed in on social media. One retired NFL receiver tweeted, "Let that boy play." Period. Jamal, still unaware of the full scope, remained focused on his daily grind. But Miss Thelma noticed the change. She saw the way people at church approached them differently, how the grocery store clerk slipped a free sports drink into his bag, how the school counselor suddenly offered to help with college essays. Something was shifting. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the oaks and Jamal packed up his gear after another grueling session, Marcus tossed him a towel and said, "You know they're talking about you, right?" Jamal looked up. "Who?" "Everybody," Marcus said. "Scouts, coaches, fans. You're not invisible anymore, man. You've been benched on the field, but off the field, you're blowing up." Jamal stared at the horizon for a moment, letting the words sink in. It felt unreal. He hadn't asked for a movement. He'd only tried to stay true. But something inside him stirred, a cautious flame, the beginning of belief. Not just in his talent, but in the idea that truth, when held steady long enough, would eventually shine through. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he thought about everything he had endured. The silence, the humiliation, the ache of being sidelined. But now, voices were rising, ones that saw not just his game, but his grit. And somewhere, miles away in offices and training facilities and coaching rooms, men and women were saying his name. Not as a problem, but as a priority. It began the way most confrontations do, not with shouting or fists or slamming doors, but with a silence so thick it could choke. The kind of silence that creeps into a room and makes everyone sit a little straighter, breathe a little quieter, wait a little longer for the other shoe to drop. It was late afternoon, the day before the last regular season game, and Coach Daniels had called a closed-door team meeting in the locker room. The players filed in slowly, the way boys do when they're unsure if they're about to be praised or punished. Jamal sat at the end of the third row, arms folded across his chest, eyes locked on a stain in the tile floor that he'd memorized after so many weeks spent sitting, benched and silent. Daniels stood in front of them like a preacher about to deliver a hard sermon, hands behind his back, mouth pressed into a line. "There's been a lot of talk lately," he began, his voice even but cool. "Noise from outside this program. People who don't understand what we do here, questioning our decisions." He paused, letting the weight of that accusation settle over the boys like dust. "Let me be clear. I don't run this team by popular vote. I run it with discipline, structure, respect." His eyes scanned the room and, for the briefest moment, landed on Jamal. "And I won't have that structure undermined. Not by parents, not by reporters, not by players who think they're bigger than the game." A few heads dropped. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one spoke. Malik clenched his fists in his lap. Daniels continued, "Tomorrow's game is important. We win, we make playoffs. We lose, we're done. So I'm making some adjustments." He looked down at the clipboard in his hand. "Starting lineups changing. Carter, you're suiting up." The room seemed to hold its breath. Jamal didn't move. Daniels didn't look up. "I expect you to act like you belong there," he added, voice tight. "No antics. No grandstanding. Just football." A long silence followed. Jamal's heart thudded in his chest like a drum. Not because he wasn't ready, but because he knew exactly what this was. It wasn't a reward. It was containment. A calculated gesture to quiet the noise, to appease the growing number of voices calling for his return. Daniels wasn't giving in. He was buying time. Still, Jamal nodded once, quietly. Yes, sir. That was it. No cheers. No pats on the back. Just a single nod and the thrum of tension hanging in the air. After the meeting, Malik caught up to him by the lockers. You gonna play like he wants? He asked, voice low. Jamal looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed a smile to slip through. I'm gonna play like I always have. But this time, they'll all be watching. That night, Coach Daniels sat in his office alone, the walls lined with trophies and plaques and photos from seasons past. But none of those pictures could help him sleep, because in the deepest part of him, he knew something had shifted. The control he'd once held with an iron grip was slipping through his fingers, and no matter how much he tightened his jaw or barked orders, the tide was turning. And Jamal? He wasn't afraid anymore, because now he didn't need permission to be seen. The next morning, long before the stadium filled, before the band tuned their instruments or the cheerleaders warmed up their chants, Jamal stood at the 50-yard line in full pads, staring at the empty bleachers. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, the kind his mama used to say before a test or a big day. Then he breathed deep, opened his eyes, and began to stretch. By game time, the stands were overflowing, not just with parents and students, but with reporters and scouts and strangers who'd heard whispers of story too unbelievable not to witness for themselves. Daniel stood stone-faced on the sideline, arms crossed, lips tight. But he couldn't stop what was coming. He couldn't contain the momentum that had been building outside the lines of the field, far beyond the reach of his whistle. And in the final moments before kickoff, Jamal jogged to the huddle, helmet under his arm, head held high. His teammates gave him space, then, one by one, stepped in closer. Malik clapped him on the shoulder. Let's give them something to remember. Jamal nodded. Let's give them the truth. And as the whistle blew and the game began, it wasn't just a contest of yards and points. It was the culmination of months of silence, of restraint, of waiting. It was the beginning of a reckoning. And when Jamal lined up for the first play, hands ready, eyes locked on the defense, he wasn't just a bench player anymore. He was a storm long held back. And now, finally, he was about to be unleashed. The stadium lights blazed like miniature suns overhead, casting everything below into sharp, cinematic contrast. The crisp white of the chalk lines, the sheen of the players' helmets, the nervous flickers of movement in the stands. The energy in the air pulsed like a second heartbeat, rising with every second that ticked off the clock. Foremost in attendance, this was just another Friday night game, another chance to cheer, another contest to win or lose. But for Jamal Carter, this wasn't a game. It was a reckoning. From the very first snap, he was electric. Not flashy, not loud, but devastatingly precise. On the first offensive play, he ran a textbook slant across the middle, threading through defenders like he was moving through water, catching the ball with both hands and absorbing a hit without so much as a flinch. 12-yard gain. The crowd murmured, then grew louder. On the next drive, he lined up wide left, faked a curl, then broke into a go route that left the cornerback 2 full steps behind. The quarterback saw it, launched it, and Jamal caught the ball over his shoulder like it was silk floating into his palms. Touchdown. The stadium erupted. But Jamal didn't dance. He didn't pound his chest or point to the sky. He simply jogged back to the sideline, handed the ball to the ref, and let the silence speak louder than any celebration. Coach Daniels watched from the sideline, jaw tight, arms folded, but even he couldn't deny what he was seeing. Jamal wasn't just playing well. He was commanding the game. He read the defense like a book, anticipated coverages, adjusted his routes before the snap. At halftime, with the Panthers up by 2 scores, the buzz in the stands had turned electric. Phones lit up with texts, clips of Jamal's plays circulating faster than wildfire. Local reporters clutched their notebooks like lifelines, whispering to each other, "He's the real deal." Every bit of it. But the third quarter brought pressure. The opposing team adjusted, shifted to double coverage, tried to press him at the line. Jamal responded with calm ruthlessness. He used his footwork to break free, his hands to fight through jams, his eyes to track every ball like a hawk. On one critical 3rd and long, he ran a post corner so clean it left both defenders scrambling in opposite directions. The ball floated through the air, high, hanging, and for a moment time slowed. Everyone watched. The crowd held its breath. Jamal leapt. The safety hit him midair, but Jamal came down with the ball cradled against his chest, his body bouncing hard against the turf. First down. He stood up without a word, jogged back to the huddle. The stadium lost its mind. Coach Daniels pulled him aside once, in the 3rd quarter, voice tight. "Keep it simple," he said. "No heroics." Jamal looked him square in the eye. "I'm just playing football, coach." And that was the truth. He wasn't showboating. He wasn't drawing attention. He was simply doing what he'd trained to do, what he'd waited for in silence, prepared for in solitude. And now, the world was finally watching. In the 4th quarter, with the game tied and the clock bleeding down, the Panthers had one final drive. Everyone knew where the ball was going. The defense stacked against him. The stadium lights felt hotter, brighter, heavier. On 2nd and goal with 10 seconds remaining, the quarterback looked to the sideline, got the signal, then turned to Jamal. Their eyes met. No words needed. The ball was snapped. Jamal burst off the line, faked inside, then cut to the corner of the end zone with a sharpness that sliced through the night air. The quarterback threw it high, only where Jamal could reach. And reach he did. He soared, his body extended like a drawn bow, hands outstretched. He caught the ball in midair, tucked it to his chest, and came down just inside the white line. Touchdown. Pandemonium. The stadium roared. Students screamed. Grown men wiped their eyes. Miss Thelma, in her Sunday best, even on a Friday, stood in the stands with both hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. Reporters scrambled for footage. Scouts stood up, clapping, shaking their heads in disbelief. Jamal didn't celebrate. He walked slowly to the sideline, placed the ball on the bench, and sat down. His heart was pounding, not from exertion, but from release. After all the weeks of silence, the doubts, the slights, the pain of being invisible, he had answered the only way he knew how, with grace, with skill, and with undeniable truth. The scoreboard read Panthers 34, Rivals 28, but the numbers couldn't capture what had truly been won. After the game, the team swarmed him. Teammates who had been silent now reached out. Hugs, slaps on the back, hands clasped in his. Malik lifted his arm high like a trophy. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. But Jamal said little. He just smiled, nodded politely, and thanked them. In the locker room, Daniel stood at the front, clearly uncertain, clearly shaken. He cleared his throat, looked down at the clipboard he no longer needed. "Good game," he muttered, then turned away. That was it. No apology. No acknowledgement. But Jamal didn't need it anymore. The truth had played out on the field. Undeniable, irreversible. And everyone who mattered had seen it. That night, as he sat at home, still in uniform, helmet resting on the table beside him, Jamal looked out the window at the quiet street. The stars above blinked faintly in the black sky. Miss Thelma brought him a cup of sweet tea, sat down beside him, and whispered, "Your mama would be proud." He nodded, eyes glistening, because for the first time in a long time, he felt seen. Not just as an athlete, but as a young man who had held his ground, walked through fire, and come out the other side not bitter, but brighter. The following Monday morning, the world felt strangely still. The weekend's thunder had rolled through, leaving behind a town buzzing with stories, but cloaked in a calm that hinted something bigger was on the horizon. Riverview High bustled like usual, students filtering through the halls with the lazy confidence of those counting down to winter break. But in the main office, the secretary glanced up from her desk as a man in a dark gray suit walked in, briefcase in hand, a look of easy confidence in his stride. His name was Charles Gaines, and he didn't wait to be announced. He simply nodded politely, asked for the principal, and made his way down the corridor like someone who knew the weight of his presence. That same hour, Jamal sat in chemistry class, head down, pretending to focus while his mind drifted back to Friday night's game. It replayed in fragments. The roar of the crowd, the crunch of turf under his cleats, the feel of the football as it kissed his palms and settled into his chest like it had always belonged there. He hadn't spoken much since then, not because he didn't have thoughts, but because he was still trying to absorb it all. The look on Daniel's face, the way reporters shouted his name, the quiet pride in Miss Thelma's eyes. And then the intercom crackled. "Jamal Carter, please report to the front office." Heads turned. His classmates looked up, some with surprise, others with knowing smirks. Jamal stood, heart thudding once, twice. He grabbed his bag and walked the hallway alone, each step echoing off the linoleum like a slow drumbeat. When he entered the office, the principal stood to greet him, but beside him was the man in the suit, tall, calm, and unmistakably polished. "Jamal," the man said, stepping forward with an extended hand. "I'm Charles Gaines, recruiting coordinator at Southern Tech University. Been looking forward to meeting you." Jamal blinked, caught off guard. He shook the man's hand, firm and steady. Charles smiled. "Mind if we talk a few minutes?" They moved to a side office, the door closed behind them, and for a moment, the noise of the school faded into a muffled hum. Charles opened his briefcase, pulled out a folder, and placed it on the desk. "I'll get straight to it," he said. "We've been following your story closely. Not just the game, though that was something, but everything leading up to it. The patience, the composure, the discipline. That kind of resilience doesn't come easy. It comes from character, and that's exactly what we want on our team." He flipped open the folder. Inside was a formal letter bearing the university's seal. "This is a full-ride scholarship offer. Tuition, housing, meals, books. All of it. We believe in you, Jamal. Not just as a player, but as a young man with the kind of leadership we build programs around." Jamal stared at the paper. For a moment, the words didn't quite register. Full ride, leadership, believe in you. All the things he'd once dreamed of hearing were now resting on the table in front of him, real and undeniable. "We'd like you to come visit the campus," Charles continued. "Meet the coaches. Sit down practice. But I want you to know the offer stands. No matter what Coach Daniels thinks of you. We've seen enough." Jamal swallowed hard. "Why me? There are other players, ones who've been on the field all season." Charles leaned forward, expression softening. "Because you played through silence. You trained without attention. You led without the title. And when your moment came, you didn't take revenge. You took responsibility. That's rare. That's leadership." Jamal looked down at the letter again. The future, once so far out of reach, now sat close enough to touch. "I'll think about it," he said quietly. Charles smiled. "That's all I ask." After school, Jamal walked home slowly, the cold wind brushing against his jacket, his breath visible in the fading daylight. When he reached Miss Thelma's porch, she was already waiting, as if she knew something had shifted. He handed her the letter without a word. She adjusted her glasses, read through it once, then looked up at him with tears glistening in the corners of her eyes. "God don't miss," she whispered. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling once more, Jamal thought about everything that had led to this moment. The benches he'd warmed, the early mornings, the long runs, the days he'd questioned his worth, wondered if silence would swallow him whole. And now, the silence had turned into something else. Recognition, opportunity, a future. He didn't know what would come next, what campus life would feel like, how tough college ball would be. But he knew one thing for sure. He belonged. Not because a coach finally gave him permission, but because he had earned it, quietly, fiercely, fully. The offer was more than a scholarship. It was proof. Proof that his story mattered. That his name could rise not through anger or rebellion, but through grace and grit. And as he drifted off to sleep, the letter tucked safely beneath his pillow, Jamal Carter, once benched, once doubted, began to dream again. Not of what he'd lost, but of everything now waiting just ahead. The spring air at Southern Tech felt different, warmer somehow, with a softness that wrapped around Jamal's shoulders like the embrace of something long awaited. It had been 3 months since the letter arrived, 3 months since the world shifted beneath his feet and opened into something vast, unfamiliar, and full of possibility. Now, as he stood at the edge of the practice field, cleats sinking gently into the turf, jersey freshly pressed and clinging to his frame, Jamal Carter felt the weight of his journey and the lightness of new beginnings settle into balance inside him. He was no longer the kid sitting quietly on the sideline, hoping to be noticed. He had been noticed. He had been chosen. And now, he was ready to prove that choosing him hadn't been a gamble. It had been a promise waiting to be kept. The first few weeks on campus had been intense. New playbooks, new teammates, new eyes studying him from every angle. Some were curious, others skeptical. A few had heard the story, asked careful questions about Riverview, about Daniels, about the game that changed everything. Jamal never spoke with bitterness. He spoke with clarity. "I just stayed ready," he would say. And that was all. On the field, he moved with precision, not just athleticism, but purpose. Coaches noticed. Teammates respected him, not because he was flashy, but because he showed up early, stayed late, and never asked for special treatment. He wasn't trying to be a star. He was trying to be consistent. And in a world where consistency is rare, that made him stand out more than any one-handed catch or breakaway sprint. Off the field, he began to breathe again. The pressure that had once wrapped around his chest like barbed wire was gone. He made friends. He found a rhythm. He called Miss Thelma every Sunday afternoon without fail, updating her on classes, practices, and the cafeteria food that he swore tasted better just because it was free. Sometimes he visited the chapel on campus, sitting quietly in the back, not always praying, but listening for that quiet voice inside that had once kept him grounded when everything else was falling apart. And slowly, Jamal began to realize that this was never just about football. It was about becoming whole. Then came the email that took him by surprise. It was from a student journalist back in Riverview, a young woman named Kayla, who'd been following his story since that final game. She was writing a piece for a local magazine, a retrospective on perseverance, and she wanted to interview him. Not just about the touchdown, she wrote, but about what it meant. Jamal hesitated at first. He wasn't one for attention, but something in her message touched him. Maybe it was how she said the town hadn't stopped talking about that night, how kids now wore his number to school, how parents told their children about the boy who waited, who worked, who won. So he agreed. They spoke on Zoom, and Kayla asked questions that dug deeper than stats or scores. She asked about silence, about patience, about faith. And when the article came out, the title struck him like a bell. Jamal Carter, Why Grace Wins. It wasn't a headline built for clicks. It was a statement, and it echoed. Coaches from other schools reached out. A nonprofit invited him to speak at a youth event. One mother wrote to say that her son had been benched unfairly and almost quit until he heard Jamal's story. Jamal read her email 3 times, then replied with the same words that had become his quiet anthem, "Stay ready." That summer, he returned to Riverview for a few weeks before preseason camp. Not with fanfare, not with cameras, but quietly like he always had. He visited Miss Thelma first, helped her fix a leaky faucet, then sat with her on the porch while the cicadas hummed and the air turned gold. One afternoon, he stopped by the field where it all began. The paint on the bleachers had faded, but the lines on the turf were still clear, the memories still sharp. A few kids were throwing a ball around. They stopped when they saw him. One of them approached, wide-eyed and nervous. "You're Jamal, right?" the boy asked. "The one from the game?" Jamal smiled. "Yeah, that's me. Coach says you never gave up." "That true." Jamal thought for a moment, then knelt to the boy's level. "I wanted to," he admitted. "More than once. But I didn't. Not because I knew it would all work out, but because I couldn't let someone else decide when my story ended." The boy nodded slowly, like he was storing those words somewhere deep. As Jamal walked away, he heard the boy call out, "I'm going to stay ready too." That night, back home in his room, Jamal found the old football his mama had given him when he was 7. It was worn and scuffed, the laces loose. He held it in his hands and remembered her voice, soft and steady. "Baby, whatever you do, do it with love, even when they don't see you, especially then." And he realized she'd been right. Football had brought him here. But love for the game, for his people, for the truth, had carried him through. It was never just about catching a ball. It was about catching a purpose. And now, Wherever he went, whatever he did, that purpose would go with him. Because Jamal Carter had become more than a player. He had become a symbol of grace, of grit, of a story that refused to end on the bench. And so, from the quiet of the bench to the roar of the crowd, Jamal Carter's journey reminds us that sometimes the most powerful victories are the ones we win within ourselves, through patience, perseverance, and staying true when no one's watching. His story isn't just about football. It's about dignity. It's about grace. And it's about how the light always finds those who keep showing up in the dark. Thank you so much for watching and listening to this story. If it touched you, inspired you, or reminded you of your own journey, we'd love to hear from you. Please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Whether it's a thought, a feeling, or a story of your own, your voice matters here. We read every single comment, and your words help this community grow stronger together. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember, your story isn't over yet. Keep going.